Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SEI webcast, where we will talk about connecting cyber risk managers to executives, understanding risk governance and appetite. My name is Matt Trevors. I'm a technical manager here at the Software Engineering Institute, and I will be your host for the next 30 minutes. I am joined today by my friend and colleague, Brett Tucker. Hello,
Hey,
Brett.
how are things?
Not too bad. How about yourself, sir?
Good, good.
Great.
Thanks for having me today. As Matt said, I'm Brett Tucker. I'm the technical manager for cyber risk at the Software Engineering Institute.
Great, great, Rick. Brett, so before we dive in, I just want to let folks know that we will be monitoring questions on YouTube. So if you have any questions for Brett, please don't hesitate to ask. So Brett, let's start with the softball and let's get this conversation, put some context around it. So let's talk about risk. So when you say risk, what should people interpret the meaning of risk to be to you?
Yeah, that's a great idea, Matt. Let's level set with the idea and just start basic that risk is an uncertainty. It's something that could be or it could possibly happen. I mean, we can talk about additional elements to wrap into that notion of what risk is. We talk about assets that may be impacted, so how you may feel the pain. We may talk
Hmm.
about vulnerabilities that may present themselves that allow that risk to take place. We could also talk about the likelihood of that risk potentially happening. But at the end of the day, it's an uncertainty. It's something that could happen.
Okay, great. So when I'm talking about risk with different people, I'll hear someone talk about qualitative versus quantitative risk. Can you go ahead and elaborate on those two terms related to risk?
Yeah, sure. So qualitative, like right once again, coming at the very base level, it's trying to relate a risk to somebody in words, right? And how if something is not going to feel good, or if it's going to feel bad, or we have a low feeling about this, we have a high feeling, it's something that's very likely to happen or very unlikely. And quantitative really gets more to that numeric side. It really tries to put bounds around the words that we're trying to say when we talk about a risk. So when we start talking about it, you're not necessarily going to feel pain by betting at a casino and putting $10 down, but you will feel pain if you put $100 down. Now we've really kind of quantified the conception of that risk and how we actually can relate to each other and what I think is risky versus what you may not think to be risky.
Great, great. So I have a similar example. So, in this day and age of COVID-19, we will have mostly daily briefings by the coronavirus task force. And you'll have President Trump, Vice President Pence, Dr. Fauci, and Dr. Birx up there talking about the situation we're in. And as Vice President Pence is speaking, he will talk about the threat to the U.S. population as low. Correct. So that's very qualitative on his part. However, earlier this week, Dr. Birx and Dr. Fauci had some slides with some pretty gut wrenching slides where they talked about the number of deaths in the US, which is very quantitative. So that would be another way that I would see quantitative, qualitative. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very relevant example. And to be honest with you, notice you said the word gut wrenching. I mean, when you quantify a risk and you put numbers around it, it really grounds people. It kind of, if you were to say to somebody, I think something feels risky, and you go and relate to them, well, it's driving without a seatbelt, some people will say, hey, I do that all the time. And to be honest, I don't even think twice about it. But now when you
Right.
wrap numbers around it and you start talking about auto accidents in a year and the fact that it could be deadly, and a great example with the COVID-19, it really starts driving home that there's real impact there. There's real pain to be felt.
Right. Right. And the really interesting thing about that also is that they're largely saying the same thing. So if you take the population of the US and using the numbers they talked about, you're really talking about less than 1% death of the population, which I believe most people would associate it with low, but still, it just projecting it with low versus actual numbers, it
Well,
brings about different thoughts.
right. Once again, low is necessarily a relative term, right? So
Hmm.
some people may
Right,
think that is necessarily a high.
right,
The idea is though that we have that common touchstone, and this really it becomes important too, especially and let's talk about the perspective of relating in an enterprise. where maybe you have executives who are trying to tell the organization how to make decisions, risk-based
Hmm.
decisions, and how to invest their resources properly.
Right.
If you leave a lot of excuse me, if you leave a wide open door of interpretation for hundreds of managers or tens of managers even to make their own decisions based upon qualitative words, you're going to
Hmm.
get a lot of different answers. So,
Right.
as much as you can, try and put numeric bounds or tolerances around that appetite. Here's how we feel about a risk, but then again, go back and look at these numbers and compare the impacts that you're seeing and make that risk-based decision with those numbers.
Right. Absolutely correct. I also want people to realize that quantitative doesn't have to be a specific number. It can absolutely be a range. Would you agree with that, Brett?
Yeah, absolutely. So, to work in absolutes is really hard. Once again, try and fit yourself in the shoes of every manager in the enterprise. They're all looking at different scenarios. They may be looking at, maybe the same risk or risks that have interdependencies, but their
Hmm.
context may be different. So when you
Okay.
provide them that range, you give them that area of decision making where they can actually operate and they can actually make better decisions. Not all decisions are binary. So if you give me a range to operate within, maybe I can scale my response and invest resources more wisely or prioritize better with a range of tolerance to work with.
Right. And I'm just looking at the chat here, Brett, and one of the commenters said it is not just the numbers for COVID-19, is the unknown. And I think that speaks to what you said earlier. It's uncertainty, right? That's what scares us about risk. It's something to do with uncertainty.
Absolutely. And you know what? Let me actually point to that too and recharacterize risk as well. Yes, I absolutely agree. COVID-19, there is a lot of um, threat there, and I would be loath to make it sound like people dying is not a horrible thing. It is. But at the same time, if you look at numbers on the other side of people who are surviving, there's this
Hmm.
opportunistic idea too. With if we make risk-based decisions in how we apply treatment, things of that nature, we could
Hmm.
have opportunity in saving lots of lives. So it's
Right.
looking at two sides of that risk coin. And once
Hmm.
again, let's play that back into how an enterprise may see things as well, right? Just as much as some people may seeing entering, let's say, a certain theater, geographic theater right now, Asia, for example, where they're having a lot of troubles, there's a lot of
Hmm.
threat there,
Hmm.
whether it's geopolitical or whether it's dealing with COVID. But the other notion is that there's a large economy there. So people may
Hmm.
see the flip side of that risk coin right now and say, hey, there's a lot of opportunity there for maybe potential sales or building a new network of customers.
Okay. Great. Well, thanks. I think we've exhausted that for now. I'm
Yeah.
going to move on to some other topics. So, how about other terms that I hear often conflated in the world of risk management? That is appetite or risk appetite versus risk tolerance. Can you give the listeners your thoughts?
Yeah, so absolutely. There's, this textbook definition of appetite, and it's how much, risk an organization is willing to take on. And classically, you're going to hear it characterized as, we have a low appetite for seeking any ventures outside of a geographic area, or we have a high appetite for looking at new technologies and investing in new innovative things. Once again, you're really going to get a whole bevy or mixture of responses there in terms of how your employee base or how your managers may see that in making risk-based decisions. So an appetite statement is good as far as giving like a general direction or a notion to an organization. But when you bound it with tolerances, when you put that numerical range around those words, once again, it gives them that anchor, that touchstone to come back to say, okay, so I've gone through, I've done this analysis. I see that the business impact would be possibly a $1 billion gain, or if you're talking about the federal government, maybe savings on a budget. And if that's the case, it can enable a manager to make that decision, make it almost an absolute form. Say, hey, if I can make that risk come to fruition, I could really deliver on this potential risk as an opportunity, and they would make the right decision.
Okay, great. So, I know you teach over at the Heinz College, and I'm sure you've had to have this conversation multiple times with students. On average, how often do you feel as if the students have an appreciation for the difference between appetite and tolerance?
Oh man, that's a really great question. And to be honest with you, it doesn't even have to apply just to graduate students because I see
Hmm.
it in my executive students as well. And there's tends to be a disconnect at times. A lot of people are actually very happy with seeing a qualitative statement because let's face it, once again, they see a lot of free space. Hey, it's open to a lot of interpretation. I can do a lot of things with this. And by the way, that's not a bad thing necessarily. So it
Hmm.
depends on the amount, and this is where that G word comes in, governance. It depends on
Mm.
how the governance structure wants to manage the organization. Do they want to provide a lot of freeboard or a lot of open area for people to make broad decisions that can drive the enterprise to maybe a great place or potentially a threatening area where executives or the board or whoever's setting that appetite may not be happy?
Oh, awesome. Great. Thank you. So I know earlier this year you had the opportunity to go to RSA and do
Yeah.
some booth talks. Can you describe your booth talk or your elevator pitch, and then just jump right into the Octave Forte product that you've been working on as of late?
Yeah, sure. So to level set everybody who may be not familiar with Octave, it's been around for about 20 years. It's a risk management process. Octave actually stands for Operationally Critical Threat Asset Vulnerability Evaluation. And over time, it's evolved. Most recently, there was the Octave Allegro process, which takes information risk and it does an analysis. It establishes criteria, numeric criteria as best as possible. Let's go back to that tolerance discussion, and it will identify risks and help an analyst understand not only the bounds of the risk in terms of how much impact it can occur in an organization, but it also starts getting into or digging into how someone might respond to those risks. Now, it's been my mission to evolve that tool set once again, to elevate that risk analysis above that analyst level into that governance structure. And think about this. Executives are thinking about far more than just information risk in any given enterprise. There's strategic risks and there's operational risks. There's a lot of things outside of the cyber realm. So what we want to do is we want to elevate the cyber risks to those other risks so that you're talking about apples to apples comparison. And that is what I'm doing with Octave Forte, the next evolution. And I'm working on publishing that paper right now so that people can understand the 10-step process. The
Mhm.
10-step process within Octave Forte, just as a very quick summary, will take a nascent organization and help it build a governance structure, an appetite statement, and the policy and procedure that goes around it. And then it walks that risk organization through a process of identifying risks as they link to high value assets, how to develop proper responses, and then how to manage those responses. And once again, radiate that back up in the governance structure.
Awesome. Great. So you said some very powerful words in there where you talked about raising it from risk analysis up into the governance. Can that to me says you're talking about the difference between risk management and risk analysis. Can
Yeah.
you demystify those two terms for our audience, please?
Yeah, and once again, this is something that I'm sure a lot of people will see possibly differently. But in my mind, if you just take it apart, risk analysis is what I'm thinking of as the analyst at the front lines who are doing maybe the business impact assessments. Maybe they're using a methodology like FAIR or something like that to get very analytic and understand like the numeric bounds of what's taking place, and maybe even understand the likelihood of that particular risk. And by the way, there are other metrics we could talk about. Maybe they're assessing the velocity of a given risk. So they're really trying to wrap their head around what that risk means, trying to get that qualitative risk sentence into something that's more meaningful. And actually, let me relate that in terms of cyber as well. So many times we have cyber risk analysts who look at these things and they try to relate to their management team these risks, and it comes off it as a lot of bits and bytes, very technological. And people in the governance structure on the managerial side who may not be as cyber savvy, excuse me, will say something effective. Hey, I need this translated more into like a dollars and cents. And
Hmm.
let's say they make that connection. So now we're talking about the actual risk management piece, where you're actually picking up that risk and you're projectizing it. You have a response plan. You're going to mitigate it. So you could put a scope and a schedule and a budget around that mitigation plan and implement it. Now, it may be a just do it, but in most cases, we know a lot of these risks are big and hairy, and they have a lot of moving parts in their complexities. So you actually manage that risk going down that path by implementing those response plans, monitoring to see if those response plans are making a meaningful impact in terms of reducing the likelihood of that risk, or maybe reducing the probable impact that may come if the risk were to come to fruition. That's the actual management side of it.
Okay, perfect. So you triggered another couple words. You used the terms fair and business impact analysis. Can
Yeah.
you just describe for the audience how business impact analysis plugs into Octave Forte?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's start again that Octave is a 10-step process. And in the first few steps, you're building the policy, the procedure, which may, by the way, apply standards that exist. FAIR could be one of them. It's not required, but as it takes the analyst through that process of understanding what their high value assets are, what the vulnerabilities may be related to that, you may decide or prioritize maybe a top 10 or maybe a top 5 risks that you really want to do a deep dive on and understand at greater detail or length the impact. So that's where you would have a factor analysis for information risk or FAIR that you may want to apply to that. There are other things too. Business impact analysis, yet another tool that you could use where you're actually going to look at how that asset fits in the enterprise, and you're going to look and see if I remove that asset from the value chain that it's providing, how am I going to feel pain? If I can't recover it, am I going to lose a critical function that actually could stop the enterprise dead in the water? And what does that translate to in terms of money, or maybe loss of resource in terms of people, or even more importantly, in terms of time?
Okay, great. So I'm just reviewing the chat session again here, Brett, and I'm seeing a lot of fans of ISO standards.
Uh,
So ISO Guide 73, definitions for risk appetite and risk tolerance, and then another reference to ISO 31000, risk management. So as
yeah.
you were developing Octave Forte, what sort of standards, such as the ISO standards, did you use to influence how you generated your Wheel of Forte or the 10-step
Yeah.
process?
So certainly ISO 31000, and so as best as possible. Now Forte can't be an answer for everything, and it certainly there's a lot of overlap with a lot of these standards. ISO, a lot of what NIST has put out, COSO. There's a lot of great information out there. What I tried to do with Forte is take the most practical things that I've seen in the business world before I came to the SCI, and I was also in the federal government prior to that, and trying to take the most practical parts to actually get a program moving, right? As a program gets more elaborate, as it starts to get more mature, I can see greater adoption of standards. So what I do have in Forte is kind of like the base blocking and tackling elements of standards. ISO 31000 for sure. NIST, you talk about their special 800 SP 800 series. There's a lot of risk management direction that you can find in there. You'll find elements of that in Forte, if anything, reference to it.
Okay, perfect. So you kind of broached the RMF topic when you referenced NIST. Can you
Oh,
compare and
yeah.
contrast the risk management framework with Octave Forte?
Yeah, so in my mind, the risk management framework, which by the way is a great process, what it does is it's largely focused on ingesting assets into an enterprise. So if I'm taking in maybe an application or some kind of hardware, I'm trying to understand the life cycle it will have in the organization and the risks related to ingesting it, utilizing it, maybe even keeping it maintained, and then eventually sending it to its grave when you replace it or you just get rid of it. Now, Forte that I was speaking about is at the 10,000-foot level. It's the next level higher, right? That's where the analysis is taking place in RMF. If you want to translate that up in the enterprise and demonstrate how you're managing that kind of risk, that's where Forte would come in. I would think RMF to be a little bit more analogous to an analyst in terms of where Allegro's at, right? Where
Hmm.
they could do a really good handshake in terms of understanding, identifying risks related to, especially information assets, and understanding the impacts that could come with risks in ingesting those new assets.
Okay, perfect. So, we're coming to the end of our time here, and the title of this was "Connecting Cyber Risk Managers to Executives." What sort of guidance would you give to the risk manager who's tried to go to executives in the past and just hasn't been able to make them understand? Do you have any tips or tricks for cyber risk managers to communicate with executives? Any keywords that you think they should uh, put into their pitch?
That's a great question. Yes, I absolutely do. And actually, I've lived this life as well. So many times you have a cyber risk manager who's focused a lot on the day to day. So they have to elevate themselves above and they have to pay attention to what are the primary concerns and interests of the governance structure. And if you really do not have that direct connection with the governance structure, maybe you don't have direct tap to an executive, go and look at the organizational strategy. Try to find out where cyber fits in the enterprise. And you'll really quickly see how decisions are being made at higher levels with respect to cyber if you're not necessarily seeing that in the strategy statement of the organization. If that alone, if you make that revelation, you may understand that you have to make tap with your governance structure just to get them to understand what you do functionally, right? But beyond that, you have to have that conversation in that governance structure. So let's say you get in the game and you are starting to relate these risks. Remember to go back to that appetite statement. And if you don't have one globally for the organization, or maybe it's not specific enough, please be sure to develop one for your own organization. So that way you can relate risk within your organization at least. And you can carry that forward as you go back and try to look for resources from said governance structure. And that third pillar that I really have to emphasize too, you got to make sure that you write this down. So develop a good policy statement. And in your policy statement, make it as simple as possible to understand. I mean, it should be really base, like almost at, and I like to say sometimes, and I somewhat flippantly, but I actually mean it, at like a fifth to seventh grade reading level. Everyone in the
Hmm.
organization, regardless of what they do, needs to understand that policy statement and be able to apply it. And that also goes for procedure if you're telling them specifically what to do.
Okay, great. So, Octave Forte is a 10-step process. I have a two-part question for you. What
Sure.
is and you and I know these are all like your children, so it's hard to pick favorites. But what is the most important step, if there is one, and what is the most difficult step within Octave Forte?
The most important and the most difficult. Man, those are great questions. So some of that question is contextual. Okay. If you are a nascent organization and you really have no sense or no risk policy that's existing, you really need to start at step one. And once again, that establishes those three pillars. And I provide tools and templates in this document that I'm publishing to help people craft that governance structure, to build an appetite statement, and to build a policy and a procedure around that. So I would say that's the most important. That's the base blocking and tackling. And even for a mature organization, if they need to go check themselves and see that they have those elements in place to a level and degree that's usable. So step one's probably the most important, I would say. The most challenging, now that can be really tricky. If you're talking about just a larger organization, especially a larger federated one, certainly the immediate steps after that, where you're trying to characterize all the assets in an organization, I find with a lot of our customers, a lot of our federal customers especially, there are challenges at times where a lot of the assets aren't even completely documented or understood in the organization. And remember, when I talk about assets, I'm talking about more than just hardware, software. I'm talking about people and the information and the technology and the facilities that all of those things are contributing to the value stream of an enterprise. So, operationally, technically speaking, probably the asset management piece.
Okay. Yes, that is a very wide topic, especially when you talk about technology, information, people, and facilities. It can be very, very broad and very difficult for an organization to understand assets in terms of those four buckets.
Yeah,
So,
and right at the
sorry, go
right,
ahead.
yeah, at the right level or scale too. If
Mm,
you have so many assets in an organization, how do I scale this properly so that way I can actually identify risks? Let's say it's on all laptops. Is that at a point in an
right.
organization where Is that characterized at the best granularity or level of granularity
Mhm.
that I identify individual risks and do something meaningful about them?
Right. And then to the laptop point, that asset is obviously used for more than one mission within the organization.
Oh,
So
certainly.
evaluating the risk against all that would be it's a tall order for folks to do. It sounds easy, but it's difficult to implement, like most other things.
Yeah, and I'd like to point out too, with that in that regard, you just hit on a really great point and something that I think a lot of risk managers maybe don't take enough advantage of. When you start talking about like laptops, for example, and you talked about multiple value streams that said asset, and by the way, it doesn't have to be laptops; it could be any
Right.
variety of assets, especially people. They bring value to multiple value streams, or they deliver to multiple value streams. There's an interdependency there. So if I lose that one asset, I could have a risk interdependency where I feel pain across multiple segments. So if a risk manager can really bring a great mitigation plan to avoiding loss of that critical asset, you could share that wealth across a number of risks and actually save on resources, which would be a big win for the risk management enterprise.
Right. Right. Increased return on investment, lower your total cost of ownership. Those are keywords, folks, for business people.
Ah, and you
So,
nailed it.
yeah. So, before we close out here, Brett, I have one last question from the audience. And I think this just elaborates on something we discussed a few minutes ago. So, the question is, what recommendations would you make for cyber risk to enterprise risk management, given it's all business risk?
Yeah, and this may sound elementary, so I don't want to make it sound easy. But so many times, what you really need to do is you need to dial back on the technology speak, and you have to really start translating it in terms of dollars and cents. What does it mean to an enterprise if I have so many incidents in a week, let's say? If you're handling those incidents and let's say you're triaging them well and you're really not realizing any losses necessarily, it's not going to resonate so much with an executive team. They're going to say something to the effect of, "Oh, well, clearly you're doing your job with what you have," right? You have to translate that in terms of what the potential impact could be in dollars and cents and say, "Hey, I could lose some major pieces of intellectual property, or I could have a major breach of my confidentiality, integrity, or availability." And that could translate to major pain in our organization. So we need additional resources. So at the end of the day, what I'm saying is you have to convey your risks in dollars and cents.
Okay. Well, Brett, thank you much. Thank you very much for your time, Brett. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. And folks, if you'd like to follow up with us, you can go to the SEI website and contact our business developers through that medium. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Matt.